Sophie Stark, and for my ISR project, I studied the relationship between COVID-19 and anxiety at Millbrook School. So it's first important to note that people all over the world struggle with anxiety and mental health. Some numbers for that is that 46% of adults and 20% of adolescents suffer from mental health condition. This ranges from anxiety to depression to all different types of mental health conditions. But it's also really important to note that as COVID hit, this has affected people's mental health in a negative way. It was reported that 53% of people reported that their mental health was negatively affected by COVID-19. This can be explained by lockdowns, effects on learning, in that people had to go into online learning, people had to change their job settings, people had to move, people's whole life were disrupted by the changes that were caused by COVID-19. So in order to study this relationship, I did a couple different things. So first of all, I did weekly studies, which were based on surveys that were sent out to a group of 40 participants, which included 8 individuals from each age group, which included freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors, as well as faculty. And in this, there was 4 females, or 4 people that identified as female, and 4 people that identified as male. And in these surveys, I used something called the Pandemic Emotional Impact Scale. And this was 16 different raters that are things like how anxious you feel about your overall health and well-being. Another one could be how anxious you're feeling about your family's financial status, and so on and so on. And including in this survey, there was also questions on demographics. So asking people to report on where they're from, asking people to report on what gender they identify with, and asking people to report on the age group they identify with. And including these weekly surveys, I also did my research through monthly surveys, and this went out to the entire school, which include faculty and staff, as well as students. And it was more kind of questions based around overall well-being rather than just anxiety. So questions were asked about how people rate their overall well-being for that past month, how people are feeling supported, and how they think the school is doing with supporting their individual students. As well as these different studies were going on, each week I recorded the cases in the United States and on campus, as you can see right here. So now moving into my results, there's a couple of different things I could take away from it. So first of all, as you see, as nationally COVID cases in the United States increased, if you look down here, PICE scores, which is the average score, not individual scores, the average score reported by the entire group, and also it's important to note that I did this over 18 weeks, those decreased. But then it's important to note that in week 14 on campus, there was a spike of COVID cases, which increased to 5. And the only other times we had COVID cases on campus were in the first week, but this was not part of my study, and the week before the peak, which was also 1, and then this week, which was also not part of my study. So it's shown that as cases became really real on campus, anxiety was affected and also increased. It's important also to note that there was changes in, or things we can take away from how it affected different forms or grades and how it affected different genders. So for different forms, the 3rd form was affected the most, following by the 4th form. They had the highest overall average of PICE impact scale reportings. And then females actually reported the highest overall average scores across the 18-week period. And it's really important to the groups that are affected the most. And it's also important to note that we can take away from this that 3rd form girls were possibly affected the most, and 4th form girls were affected the most by COVID-19 and its effects. Now, that's the biggest things I could take away from the study. There's some other stuff that I can go into, but those are the biggest takeaways from my results. Now moving into the discussion, there's a couple of different things that we can now kind of make some generalizations about why this happened. So it can be said that at Millbrook School, it's kind of a safe haven from COVID-19. The only real reminders of it are weekly testing and masks. Besides that, kids are allowed to go to class, people are allowed to go to the dining hall and sit with their friends, people are allowed to have somewhat a normal life. And so the reason why we saw this decrease over time was from the first week, maybe people felt kind of overwhelmed by being moved back into society, moved back into an everyday setting, but over time, as they got used to it, it decreased. And sorting by age group, other studies also found that fourth formers struggle the most. And especially at Millbrook, this can be explained by these two groups, third form and fourth form, have the most new students. They're coming into a time when there's no real landscape for high school anymore because COVID has completely changed what we think of high school. So it is understood that they struggle the most. And then actually going back to the form or the group that struggled the least was the faculty. And I discussed that in my discussion because it's actually found that adults struggle less with mental health than adolescents struggle. It is found that 19% of adults suffer with anxiety, whereas 32% of adolescents struggle with anxiety. So the age group identifiers for this study are clear that younger people struggle the most, whereas adults who have more experience with crises and more experience with changes in lifestyle, changes in routine, struggled the least. And then it's important also to note that females had the higher scores, and this can be explained by a couple of different things. First of all, females struggle more with mental health overall in the world. This can be explained by changes in hormones, more changes in their imbalances, more changes in cycles, and different things going on in their body. But it also can be explained by how females deal with anxiety. They like to ruminate, and this is also this is not true for everyone, and it's important that this is something that is widely spread, but it's also not a fact. So females tend to struggle more because they ruminate on their anxieties, they think more on their anxieties, whereas men tend to problem solve. They like to think about how they can fix the problem in their life rather than ruminating on it, which is a key difference in how females and males struggle with anxiety. And kind of now moving outside of Millbrook, and why my study was important to note is because the rest of the world, where Millbrook kind of seemed to do okay and manage these times, the rest of the world, especially adolescents, really struggled. It was found that 40.9% of participants in this study done by the CDC actually really noticed at least one new mental health struggle since COVID-19. And the reason why this really happened and why we're so different from the rest of the world, I believe, and from other studies can be shown that the rest of the world, their social interactions, their social ties were reduced or even cut off. Millbrook students were able to go to class, able to go to the dining hall, and were able to have these social interactions that benefit mental health so extremely. So actually it's found that you are twice as likely to die earlier on in your life if you have less social ties. So the biggest takeaways from the study is that people need to have social interactions. They need to go to school. They need to go to work. And their anxiety and their overall mental health will be negatively affected if this is not part of their life. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have questions.